Notice right now what's aware of these words. That awareness, that's what we're exploring today. But more specifically, we're investigating the one frequency that could transform your entire reality, yet remains blocked by the most subtle, invisible barrier you never knew existed. You are not your thoughts. You are the consciousness aware of them. And right now, that consciousness is unconsciously filtering out the very frequency that would dissolve every limitation you believe is real. What I'm about to show you, you already know. My job is simply to remove what's hiding it. Take a breath, feel your body, notice the space around you. I've spent 15 years in intensive spiritual practice, including 3 years in silent retreat and direct transmission from teachers who've walked this path before me. My teacher once told me, share only what you've realized, point only to what you can see. I'm not teaching theory, but transmission. I'm still walking this path. The difference is, I can see a few steps ahead and remember a few steps behind. If you're hearing this, you're ready. The spiritual path doesn't present teachings until the student can receive it. Here's what most people don't understand about frequency. When we talk about raising your vibration or matching the frequency of what you want, we're usually focused on the doing, the meditation, the affirmations, the practices. But there's a frequency you're already emanating right now that's so fundamental to your being that you can't even perceive it. It's like asking a fish to describe water. This frequency isn't something you create, it's something you are. But you've been unconsciously blocking it your entire life through a mechanism so automatic, so deeply programmed, that it operates beneath your conscious awareness like breathing. Pause the video and try this now. Sit comfortably and close your eyes. For the next 30 seconds, simply notice what's here when you're not trying to be anything or get anywhere. Don't meditate. Don't focus. Just notice what's naturally present. What did you observe? Most people report thoughts, sensations, maybe some restlessness. But did you notice what was noticing? Did you catch the awareness itself, the field in which all experiences arise and pass away? That awareness, that's your true frequency. It's not high or low, positive or negative. It's the source frequency from which all other frequencies emerge. But here's the profound paradox. The moment you try to access this frequency, you've already missed it. The moment you try to raise your vibration to match it, you've created separation from what you already are. The mind tells you that enlightenment, abundance, love, peace, these are states you need to achieve. This is how the ego maintains the illusion of separation, keeping you in perpetual seeking mode. But if you look directly at what's aware right now, you'll discover that what you're seeking is what's seeking. The frequency you've been blocking is the frequency of your own being. Let me show you how this blocking mechanism works. It's so subtle that spiritual teachers often miss it. Students often practice for decades without recognizing it, yet once you see it clearly, the blocking dissolves naturally, like mist in sunlight. Right now, as you listen to these words, notice if there's a subtle sense that you need to do something with this information. Maybe you're thinking about how to apply it, or what practice you should start, or whether you're understanding correctly. That very orientation, the sense that you need to do something to become what you already are, that's the blocking mechanism. It operates through what I call the improvement assumption. This is the unconscious belief that your current state is somehow deficient and needs to be fixed, raised, or transformed. Even in the most advanced spiritual practices, this assumption runs like background software. creating a subtle sense of inadequacy that blocks your natural frequency. You feel it as a gentle but persistent dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing, that you're not quite there yet, that with just a little more practice, a little more understanding, a little more effort, you'll finally access the peace, joy, and freedom that always feels just out of reach. But what if I told you that this very seeking is what's creating the distance from what you want? Let me share something that happened during my 3rd year of retreat. I'd been practicing mindfulness meditation for 12 hours a day, chasing states of deep samadhi, profound peace, transcendent awareness. I was making progress, experiencing beautiful states, having mystical insights, feeling closer to enlightenment than ever before. Then, one morning, sitting on my meditation cushion, exhausted from the effort of trying to become awakened, something completely unexpected happened. I gave up. Not gave up completely, but gave up the effort to get anywhere. I stopped trying to have a good meditation, stopped trying to be present, stopped trying to raise my consciousness. And in that moment of complete surrender, of no longer reaching for anything, the most ordinary awareness that had been there all along suddenly revealed itself as the very peace, love, and freedom I'd been seeking for years. I started laughing, not from joy, though joy was present, but from the cosmic humor of realizing I'd been like someone frantically searching for their glasses while wearing them. The frequency I'd been trying to access through countless practices and techniques wasn't hidden or blocked. It was the very awareness that was doing the seeking. This recognition changed everything, yet nothing changed at all. The thoughts were the same thoughts. The body was the same body. The breath was the same breath. But the one who was aware of thoughts, body, and breath was suddenly revealed as pure, unconditional consciousness, the source frequency from which all experience arises. When you realize you are awareness itself, not the content of awareness, life becomes an expression of love rather than a search for love. You realize you are the abundance you've been seeking. You are the peace that passeth understanding. You are the freedom that can never be earned because it was never lost. But here's what's crucial to understand. This realization doesn't happen through more doing. It happens through recognizing what's already undeniably present. The frequency you've been blocking is blocked by seeking it. Let me show you exactly how this works in practical terms. Think about something you really want in your life. Maybe it's a relationship, financial abundance, creative success, or spiritual awakening. Feel into that wanting for a moment. Notice the quality of that desire. Can you sense how it contains an implicit assumption that you don't currently have what you want? Can you feel how the very structure of wanting creates a sense of lack, of separation from what you desire? This is how the blocking mechanism operates. Every time you reach for a higher frequency, every time you try to manifest or attract or become, you unconsciously reinforce the belief that you are separate from what you want. The universe doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you are. And what you are, in your deepest nature, is the same consciousness that's appearing as everything you think you lack. But the mind immediately protests. If I stop wanting, if I stop trying to improve, won't I become complacent? Won't I stop growing? This is the ego's clever trap. It presents two options. Either you keep striving and seeking, or you become passive and stagnant. But there's a third option that the ego can't compute: acting from wholeness rather than lack. When you recognize your true nature as pure awareness, action doesn't stop, but the quality of action transforms completely. Instead of actions driven by the need to become something, you have actions expressing what you already are. This is the secret that mystics throughout history have pointed to. Jesus called it the kingdom of heaven within you. The Buddha called it your original nature. Zen masters call it your original face before your parents were born. Different words, same recognition. You are already what you seek. But recognizing this requires a profound shift in how you relate to your own experience. Instead of trying to change what arises in consciousness, you learn to rest as the consciousness in which everything arises. Instead of trying to raise your vibration, you recognize that you are the space in which all vibrations appear. Instead of trying to align with abundance, you realize you are the source from which all abundance flows. This isn't philosophical, this is absolutely practical. When you stop blocking your source frequency through seeking, your entire life reorganizes around truth rather than illusion. Relationships become expressions of love rather than strategies to get love. Work becomes creative expression rather than survival mechanism. Challenges become opportunities for deeper recognition rather than problems to solve. But let me be completely honest with you about what this path requires. The ego will try to claim this realization. It will want to make being awareness into another identity, another achievement, another way to feel special or superior. This is spiritual bypassing, and it's one of the most common ways seekers get stuck. True recognition of your nature as pure awareness naturally expresses as profound humility. You realize that this awareness is not personal. It's the same awareness appearing as every being, every experience, every moment. There's nothing to be proud of because there's no separate self to take credit. This understanding naturally expresses as compassion. When you recognize yourself as the awareness in which all experience arises, you can no longer maintain the illusion that others are separate from you. Their joy is your joy. Their suffering is your suffering. Service becomes as natural as breathing. The freedom teaching is this. When you realize you are awareness itself, you discover that you were never bound. The limitations you thought were real were simply thoughts appearing in the unlimited space of consciousness. The prison was made of the very thoughts that were seeking escape. But here's what's beautiful about this recognition. It doesn't require years of practice or special circumstances. It can happen right now, in this moment, as you hear these words. Notice who's receiving this teaching right now. Not your name, not your story, the awareness itself. Feel the stillness that underlies all movement, the silence that underlies all sound, the space that holds all objects. That stillness, that silence, that space, that's not empty. That's you. That's the frequency you've been blocking without realizing it. Not a high frequency or a low frequency. Not a positive frequency or a negative frequency. The source frequency that appears as all frequencies. When you rest as this awareness, without trying to maintain it or achieve it or understand it, something profound naturally unfolds. Life begins to flow with an effortless grace. Synchronicities multiply. Obstacles dissolve. Not through your effort, but through recognition of what you've always been. This is why all the techniques and practices ultimately point to the same recognition. Stop looking for yourself where you can never be found, and notice what's already looking. The frequency you keep blocking is the frequency of effortless being. But the mind immediately wants to know, how do I practice this? What do I do with this understanding? Here's the paradox that protects the teaching. Effort is required to become effortless. Practice is necessary to realize the practiceless state. Seeking is needed to discover what was never lost. For the next week, every hour, stop and ask, what's aware right now? Not what are you aware of, but what is the awareness itself that's aware of anything? Don't try to find an answer. Let the question dissolve into the recognition of what's already present. In conversation, notice the awareness behind words. When someone is speaking, can you sense the consciousness in which their words are appearing? Can you recognize that same consciousness as your own deepest nature? In traffic, observe the one who's frustrated. When anger or impatience arises, instead of being lost in the emotion, notice what's aware of the emotion. Rest as that awareness rather than the emotional content. Before sleep, rest as pure consciousness. Instead of reviewing the day or planning tomorrow, simply be aware of being aware. Let thoughts and sensations arise and pass in the space of open awareness. As you go through your day, notice when you slip into improvement mode, when you start thinking about how to become better, more spiritual, more successful, more anything. In those moments, pause and ask, who would improve? Who would become? When you notice the seeking mind activated, remember, the frequency you're seeking is the awareness that's noticing the seeking. This becomes natural when you realize that every experience is already an expression of your true nature. The angry thoughts, the peaceful moments, the confusion, the clarity, all of it arising in the same aware space that you are. You're not trying to have better experiences. You're recognizing yourself as the awareness in which all experiences unfold. But let me address the resistance you might be feeling right now. Part of your mind might be saying, this sounds too simple. Surely awakening requires more than just recognizing awareness. Notice who's aware of that voice. That voice isn't you. You're what hears it. Rest as the hearer, not the heard. Or maybe you're thinking, I've heard this before. I already know I'm awareness. Why am I still suffering? The difference between knowing about awareness and being aware as awareness is the difference between reading about water and drinking it. Intellectual understanding, no matter how sophisticated, is still content appearing in awareness. The recognition I'm pointing to is the shift from knowing about your true nature to being it. If you're feeling confusion, that's perfect. That means the conceptual mind is being bypassed. If you're feeling resistance, that's perfect. That's the ego's last-ditch effort to maintain separation. If you're feeling recognition, that's perfect. Trust what you're experiencing. The teaching continues to deepen, not through accumulating more concepts, but through releasing the barriers to what you already are. Each moment offers a fresh opportunity to notice what's here when you're not trying to be anywhere else. Right now, as these words are flowing through your awareness, can you sense the spacious presence that remains constant, whether the words are about struggle or freedom, seeking or finding, confusion or clarity? That presence doesn't come and go. It doesn't improve or decline. It doesn't have good days or bad days. It simply is, unconditionally, as your most intimate reality. This is the frequency that's always been available, always been broadcasting, always been you. Not hidden in some future attainment, not blocked by past conditioning, but present and accessible in this very moment. The only thing that's ever blocked this frequency is the assumption that it's blocked. The only thing that's ever separated you from wholeness is the belief in separation. The only thing that's ever kept you from your true nature is seeking it somewhere else. As you sit with this recognition, notice if there's a subtle relaxation happening. Not a relaxation you're creating, but a natural settling that occurs when seeking ends and being begins. This relaxation isn't the goal. It's the byproduct of recognizing what was always already relaxed, already whole, already free. But now the deeper question emerges. If this recognition is so simple, if our true nature is so immediately available, why do we keep forgetting it? Why do we fall back into seeking and suffering? This is where the investigation becomes both fascinating and profoundly practical. Because while recognizing awareness is instantaneous, embodying that recognition in daily life, allowing it to transform how we relate to work, relationships, challenges, and dreams, this is where the rubber meets the road. The frequency isn't blocked by some external obstacle. It's blocked by the most intimate aspects of how you've learned to be human. The frequency isn't blocked by some external obstacle. It's blocked by the most intimate aspects of how you've learned to be human. Let me show you exactly what I mean. From the moment you were born, you learned to survive by adapting your natural expression to fit your environment. If expressing joy brought approval, you learned to emphasize joy. If showing vulnerability brought criticism, you learned to hide vulnerability. If being quiet kept you safe, you learned to suppress your voice. These adaptations weren't conscious choices. They were intelligent responses to your circumstances. But over time, these survival patterns created what I call frequency filters, unconscious mechanisms that automatically edit your authentic expression before it can fully emerge. These filters are so seamless, so integrated into your sense of self, that you don't even realize you're wearing them. It's like putting on sunglasses and forgetting you're wearing them, then wondering why the world looks dim. The frequency you keep blocking is your unfiltered, authentic presence. But here's what makes this so challenging to see. These filters feel like you. The cautious part that holds back your truth feels like wisdom. The performing part that seeks approval feels like love. The controlling part that manages outcomes feels like responsibility. You've been so identified with your survival strategies that you've forgotten what you were like before you learned to be safe. Pause the video and try this. Think of a moment when you were completely yourself, maybe as a child playing, or in nature, or with someone you trust completely. Can you remember what that unguarded presence felt like? That presence is still here. It's been here all along, broadcasting its natural frequency beneath the layers of learned protection. Now notice what happens when you consider expressing that same authentic presence in your current life situation. Can you feel the subtle contraction? The quiet voice that says, "But what if?" Or, "That's not safe," or, "People might think." That contraction is the frequency filter in action. Most spiritual teachings focus on dissolving the ego, transcending the personality, or rising above human conditioning. But what I've discovered is far more practical and immediate. You don't need to destroy these protective patterns. You need to recognize them as temporary costumes worn by your essential nature. The moment you see a survival strategy clearly, not judge it, not try to change it, but simply see it, it automatically becomes transparent. Like recognizing you're wearing sunglasses, the dimming effect immediately becomes obvious and the glasses can be removed naturally. But this recognition requires tremendous honesty. It requires looking at the ways you've learned to manipulate reality to feel safe, loved, or significant. Let me walk you through the 3 primary frequency filters that block almost everyone, regardless of how much spiritual practice they've done. The first filter is what I call the approval addiction. This is the unconscious belief that your worth depends on external validation. It operates so subtly that you might not even recognize it as a spiritual issue. Notice how you feel when someone disagrees with you. Is there a slight contraction, a need to explain or justify your position? That's the approval filter engaging, automatically editing your natural response to maintain harmony. Or notice what happens when you have an idea or insight. Do you share it freely? Or is there a moment of internal calculation where you assess whether it will be well received? The approval filter doesn't just block controversial opinions, it blocks the full spectrum of your authentic expression. Your natural humor gets edited for appropriateness. Your genuine enthusiasm gets toned down to avoid seeming excessive. Your real feelings get packaged in socially acceptable forms. You end up broadcasting a diluted version of yourself, safe, pleasant, but lacking the full frequency signature of your authentic being. Here's a profound recognition. The very people you're trying to impress can sense the inauthenticity. What they're actually hungry for is the real you, unfiltered and unedited. But the approval addiction is terrified of this risk. It would rather guarantee mild acceptance than risk either deep connection or genuine rejection. The second filter is the control compulsion. This is the unconscious belief that you need to manage outcomes to be safe. It shows up as the need to have your life figured out, your emotions regulated, your relationships predictable. Notice what happens when something unexpected occurs. A change in plans, a difficult emotion, an uncertain situation. Can you feel the immediate urge to fix, figure out, or control? That urge seems so reasonable, so responsible. Of course you should try to create positive outcomes, but watch what happens to your natural frequency when you're in control mode. Your breathing becomes shallow, your body tenses, your mind races through scenarios and strategies. You've shifted from being present to managing the future. The control filter blocks what I call responsive spontaneity, your natural ability to meet each moment with fresh intelligence rather than predetermined strategies. When you're trying to control outcomes, you can't fully receive what's actually happening. You're too busy imposing your agenda on reality to notice what reality might be offering. But here's the paradox. The more you try to control your life, the more chaotic it becomes. Control creates rigidity, and rigidity breaks under the natural flow of life. The moments when your life has flowed most beautifully have been moments when you surrendered control and allowed your natural responsiveness to guide you. The third filter is the most subtle and perhaps most devastating: the inadequacy assumption. This is the unconscious belief that you need to become something other than what you are to be acceptable. This filter is so fundamental that it operates beneath all other seeking. It's the background program running beneath your spiritual practice, your self-improvement efforts, your relationship strategies. Notice if there's a chronic sense that you're not quite there yet, that with just a little more growth, healing, success, or enlightenment, you'll finally be acceptable to others, to God, to yourself. This inadequacy assumption is what drives the endless cycle of seeking. It's why you can have profound spiritual experiences and still feel like something's missing. It's why you can achieve external success and still feel somehow fraudulent. The inadequacy filter blocks what you might call intrinsic okayness, the recognition that your worth is not dependent on your performance, your achievements, or even your level of consciousness. But here's what's crucial to understand. These filters aren't personal flaws. They're universal human responses to the challenge of being vulnerable in an uncertain world. Every person you meet is wearing some combination of these same filters. The approval-seeking person, the control-oriented person, the never good enough person. These are all versions of the same basic predicament of being human. Recognizing this dissolves judgment and creates tremendous compassion. You realize that everyone is doing their best to be safe while remaining authentic, to be loved while being real, to be significant while being humble. But here's where it gets interesting. These filters don't just block your authentic expression, they actually create the very problems they're trying to solve. The approval filter, designed to ensure love, creates relationships based on performance rather than authenticity, which ultimately feels empty and unsatisfying. The control filter, designed to create security, creates rigidity and resistance, which actually makes you more vulnerable to unexpected change. The inadequacy filter, designed to motivate improvement, creates a chronic sense of not enoughness, which blocks the very confidence and self-worth it's trying to develop. Each filter creates a closed loop that reinforces its own necessity. But what happens when you recognize these patterns without trying to fix them? What happens when you see them clearly, but don't immediately reach for a solution? Something extraordinary occurs. The patterns begin to relax naturally, like a muscle that's been held in tension, finally getting permission to release. This isn't about forcing yourself to be authentic, letting go of control, or convincing yourself you're adequate. It's about creating space around these patterns so they can move and shift organically. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. A student came to me deeply frustrated with her approval-seeking patterns. She could see how much she performed for others, how exhausting it was, how it kept her from genuine intimacy. She'd tried everything, setting boundaries, practicing self-love, even doing years of therapy. But nothing seemed to break the pattern. If anything, trying to fix it had made her more self-conscious about it. I asked her to try something different. Instead of trying to stop seeking approval, I invited her to become curious about the part of her that needed approval. "What is that part afraid would happen if it stopped performing?" I asked. She immediately started crying. "It's afraid no one would love the real me." "And how old does that part feel?" I continued. "About 7, she whispered. For the first time, instead of judging her approval-seeking as a spiritual flaw, she could see it as a young part of herself that had learned to be lovable by being pleasing. Once she could hold this pattern with compassion rather than criticism, something shifted. She didn't stop seeking approval overnight, but she stopped fighting the pattern. And in that space of acceptance, the pattern began to transform, naturally. Instead of performing unconsciously, she began to notice when she was performing. Instead of being trapped in the pattern, she could feel it arising and make a different choice. Instead of the pattern controlling her, she developed a conscious relationship with it. This is the key to working with frequency filters. You don't eliminate them, you become conscious of them. Consciousness is the solvent that dissolves unconscious patterns. But this requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own psychology. Instead of seeing your patterns as problems to solve, you begin to see them as protection strategies that once served you, but may no longer be necessary. Every filter was originally an intelligent response to challenging circumstances. The approval filter helped you maintain crucial relationships. The control filter helped you navigate unpredictable situations. The inadequacy filter motivated you to grow and improve. These patterns aren't mistakes. They're evidence of your brilliant adaptability. But what was once adaptive may now be limiting. What once kept you safe may now keep you small. What once helped you survive may now prevent you from thriving. The question isn't, how do I get rid of these patterns? The question is, how do I honor what these patterns have given me while allowing them to evolve? This evolutionary approach creates space for organic transformation rather than forced change. When you stop fighting your patterns and start relating to them consciously, they begin to serve your authentic expression rather than blocking it. The approval-seeking pattern evolves into genuine sensitivity to others' needs. The control pattern evolves into skillful responsiveness. The inadequacy pattern evolves into continuous growth and learning. Instead of being unconscious reflexes, they become conscious tools. But here's what you need to understand about this process. It's not linear. You don't graduate from having patterns. You develop an increasingly conscious relationship with them. Some days you'll catch yourself performing for approval and be able to shift into authenticity immediately. Other days, you'll be completely unconscious until hours later when you realize you were in full performance mode. Some situations will trigger your control patterns more intensely than others. Some relationships will activate your inadequacy assumptions more than others. This isn't failure. This is the natural rhythm of becoming conscious. The goal isn't to become someone who never has unconscious reactions. The goal is to develop the capacity to recognize unconsciousness quickly and return to presence without judgment. Every time you notice a pattern arising, every time you catch yourself in a filter, every time you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, that's a moment of awakening. These small moments of recognition accumulate into a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own experience. But let me address something crucial that often gets missed in spiritual teachings about patterns and conditioning. You are not your patterns, but you are not separate from them either. This is a subtle but vital distinction. When you try to transcend your human patterns, you create a split between your spiritual self and your psychological self. This split is itself a form of suffering. The frequency you're learning to access includes your human patterns, not despite them. Your authentic expression isn't some pure spiritual essence that exists independently of your psychological makeup. It's your unique consciousness expressing through your particular human configuration, patterns, preferences, and all. The filter isn't your personality. The filter is the unconscious editing that happens to your personality. When the filters relax, you don't become someone else. You become more yourself, more expressive, more responsive, more alive. Your sense of humor becomes more natural. Your way of loving becomes more genuine. Your particular gifts become more available. You're not trying to become some universal spiritual archetype. You're learning to be authentically you. But this authenticity isn't indulgence. It's not anything goes, or I'll do whatever I feel like. True authenticity is aligned with wisdom, compassion, and responsibility. When you're broadcasting your natural frequency, your actions naturally serve the whole rather than just serving your ego. Authentic expression that comes from your deepest nature is inherently ethical. It doesn't harm others because it recognizes no fundamental separation between self and other. This is why the great spiritual teachers throughout history have been so uniquely themselves. The Buddha wasn't trying to be like previous Buddhas. Jesus wasn't copying other mystics. They were each expressing their deepest realization through their particular human form. Your awakening will look like you, your personality, your history, your particular way of being conscious. But here's where many people get stuck. They're afraid that if they stop trying to improve themselves, they'll become lazy, selfish, or stagnant. This fear reveals how deeply the inadequacy assumption runs. It assumes that without the pressure of not being good enough, you wouldn't naturally grow and evolve. But notice what happens when you're doing something you genuinely love. Do you need to force yourself to improve? Do you need external pressure to keep learning and growing? When you're aligned with your authentic nature, growth happens naturally. Learning becomes intrinsic. Evolution becomes effortless. You don't stop developing. You start developing in directions that genuinely serve your deepest purpose. Instead of trying to become who you think you should be, you discover who you actually are. Instead of forcing yourself to fit spiritual ideals, you allow your unique form of consciousness to emerge. Instead of comparing your path to others, you trust your own unfolding. This trust is perhaps the most radical act in a culture that's constantly telling you that you're not enough as you are. But this trust isn't naive. It's based on the recognition that your deepest nature is inherently wise, compassionate, and creative. When you remove the filters that block your natural frequency, what emerges isn't your ego unleashed. It's your essence expressed. The difference is profound. Ego expression seeks to get something: approval, control, significance. Essence expression seeks to give something: your unique gift to the world. When you're broadcasting from essence rather than ego, people can feel the difference immediately. There's no agenda beneath your presence, no hidden need being fulfilled through the interaction. You're simply offering who you are without trying to get anything in return. This kind of presence is magnetic, not because it's trying to attract, but because it's completely authentic. People are starving for genuine connection with someone who isn't performing, manipulating, or withholding. But here's what's beautiful. When you stop filtering your expression to get love, approval, or significance, you naturally become more loving, more worthy of approval, and more genuinely significant. Not because you're trying to be these things, but because these qualities are natural expressions of unfiltered consciousness. Love isn't something you do. It's what you are when fear isn't blocking it. Wisdom isn't something you acquire. It's what's revealed when confusion isn't obscuring it. Peace isn't something you achieve. It's what's always present when agitation isn't covering it. The frequency you've been blocking isn't a special state you need to create. It's your natural state that's always been broadcasting underneath the interference. But recognizing this and living from this recognition are two different things. Intellectual understanding, no matter how profound, is still content appearing in awareness. The shift I'm pointing to is from knowing about your true nature to being it moment by moment. This is where the daily practice becomes crucial. Not practice to become someone else, but practice to recognize who you already are. Every moment offers an opportunity to notice. Am I broadcasting from my filters or from my essence? Am I responding from my protective patterns or from my authentic nature? Am I trying to get something or offering what I am? These questions aren't judgments. They're invitations to wake up to what's actually happening right now. And what you'll discover is that the shift from filtered to unfiltered doesn't require tremendous effort or years of preparation. It can happen in an instant, in any moment, through the simple recognition of what's already here. But the mind that's been identified with filters for decades won't trust this simplicity immediately. It will want to know. But what about my trauma? What about my conditioning? What about my psychological work? These are valid questions, and they point to something crucial about this recognition. These are valid questions, and they point to something crucial about this recognition. Your trauma, your conditioning, your psychological patterns, these aren't obstacles to awakening. They're the very material through which awakening expresses itself in your unique life. But here's what most people misunderstand about healing and awakening. They think they need to resolve all their psychological issues before they can access their true nature. This creates an endless postponement of freedom. I'll be ready for enlightenment once I heal my childhood wounds. I'll express authentically once I overcome my social anxiety. I'll trust my essence once I process my abandonment issues. This is the mind's most sophisticated form of procrastination. It turns healing into another prerequisite for being who you already are. But what if I told you that recognizing your true nature as awareness doesn't require your psychology to be perfect? What if the very recognition of yourself as consciousness creates the optimal conditions for natural healing? Let me show you how this works. When you're identified with your patterns, when you believe you are the anxious person, the traumatized person, the inadequate person, healing feels impossible because you're trying to heal yourself. It's like a wave trying to heal itself by manipulating other waves. But when you recognize yourself as the ocean in which all waves arise, something fundamental shifts. The waves don't disappear, but your relationship to them transforms completely. You realize that anxiety is something appearing in your awareness, not something you are. Trauma responses are experiences arising in consciousness, not your identity. Inadequacy is a feeling visiting the space of your being, not a fact about who you are. From this perspective, healing isn't about getting rid of difficult experiences. It's about providing space for whatever is arising to move, transform, and integrate naturally. This is why some people can have profound spiritual awakenings while still carrying significant psychological patterns. The awakening doesn't eliminate the patterns. It changes the context in which they're held. Instead of patterns that define you, they become patterns you're aware of. Instead of problems that prove something's wrong with you, they become information about what needs attention and integration. Let me share something that happened with a student who'd been sexually abused as a child. She'd done decades of therapy, healing work, and spiritual practice. She could understand intellectually that she wasn't her trauma, but the body memories and emotional reactions seemed to have a life of their own. There, she came to me frustrated and exhausted. "I know I'm awareness," she said. "I can see that clearly in meditation. But the moment someone touches me unexpectedly, I'm back in survival mode. How can I be enlightened if my body is still traumatized?" I asked her to close her eyes and notice what was aware of the frustration she was feeling about her trauma responses. Not to change the frustration, just to notice what was noticing it. As she rested her attention in that aware space, something shifted. She realized that even the most intense trauma responses were arising in the same unconditional awareness that was present during her peak spiritual experiences. "The trauma isn't happening to awareness," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's happening in awareness." This recognition didn't eliminate her trauma responses overnight, but it fundamentally changed her relationship to them. Instead of trauma reactions proving that she wasn't awake, they became opportunities to practice resting as awareness while difficult experiences moved through. Over time, held in the space of accepting awareness, the trauma patterns began to dissolve naturally, not through fighting or fixing, but through being witnessed with infinite patience and compassion. This is how consciousness heals, not by eliminating what's unwanted, but by providing space for everything to be exactly as it is until it can transform in its own timing. Your psychological patterns are not evidence that you're not awakened. They're the specific forms through which your awakening learns to express itself. But this requires a radical shift in how you understand healing itself. Most therapeutic approaches operate from the premise that something is wrong and needs to be fixed. This is valuable and necessary work, but it can inadvertently reinforce the very inadequacy assumption we've been exploring. Consciousness-based healing operates from a different premise. Nothing is fundamentally wrong with you, but aspects of your experience may be unconscious and need to be met with awareness. Instead of trying to eliminate symptoms, you learn to relate to symptoms consciously. Instead of trying to transcend patterns, you learn to be present with patterns. Instead of trying to heal yourself, you learn to recognize the healing power of your own aware presence. This doesn't mean you become passive or avoid getting help when needed. It means your approach to healing is informed by the recognition of who you truly are. From the perspective of awareness, every psychological pattern is perfect information about how consciousness has learned to protect itself in your particular life circumstances. Your anxiety isn't a disorder. It's intelligence trying to keep you safe in situations that feel threatening. Your depression isn't a pathology. It's your system's way of conserving energy when life feels overwhelming. Your anger isn't a problem. It's power responding to perceived injustice or boundary violations. When you understand your patterns as intelligent responses rather than personal flaws, you can work with them rather than against them. But here's what's crucial. This understanding can't be intellectual. It has to be lived, felt, embodied in your actual experience with these patterns. The next time anxiety arises, instead of immediately trying to calm down or figure out what's wrong, pause and ask, what is this anxiety trying to protect me from? What does it need me to know? When depression descends, instead of fighting it or judging yourself for feeling it, create space and inquire, what is this depression responding to? What in my life needs attention or change? When anger flares, instead of expressing it unconsciously or suppressing it completely, breathe into the sensation and ask, what boundary is being crossed? What injustice is this anger illuminating? This kind of conscious dialogue with your patterns creates a collaborative relationship rather than an adversarial one. You're not trying to get rid of parts of yourself. You're learning to include all parts of yourself in awareness. And from this space of inclusive awareness, your patterns can serve their authentic function without controlling your life. Anxiety can inform you about genuine risks without paralyzing you with imaginary fears. Depression can signal the need for rest and reevaluation without convincing you that life is hopeless. Anger can motivate appropriate action without exploding into destructive rage. Your psychological patterns, met with awareness, become allies in your awakening rather than obstacles to it. But let me address something that often comes up when people begin this approach to their patterns. Sometimes when you start relating to your psychology with compassion instead of judgment, there can be a period where emotions feel more intense rather than less. This isn't regression, it's integration. For years, you may have been unconsciously suppressing, managing, or transcending difficult feelings. When you create space for them to actually be felt and witnessed, there can be a backlog of unexpressed emotion that needs to move through your system. This is natural and healthy, but it can be disconcerting if you're expecting immediate relief. The mind might say, "This consciousness approach isn't working. I feel worse than before." But feeling worse temporarily often precedes feeling authentically better. It's like cleaning out a cluttered closet. Things get messier before they get organized. What's happening is that suppressed material is finally getting space to surface and release. Emotions that have been frozen in your system are beginning to thaw and flow. This phase requires tremendous self-compassion, and often benefits from professional support. There's no spiritual bypassing here. Some healing work may need to happen in therapeutic settings with trained practitioners, but the consciousness recognition provides the container for this healing work. You're not healing yourself. You're providing aware space for healing to happen naturally. And what you'll discover is that your capacity to be present with difficult emotions expands dramatically when you're not identified as the person having the emotions. When you know yourself as the space in which emotions arise, you can feel sadness fully without being overwhelmed by it. You can experience fear completely without being paralyzed by it. You can be present with anger without being consumed by it. This isn't emotional numbing or detachment. It's emotional freedom, the ability to feel fully while remaining centered in your true nature. But here's where we need to address the relationship between awakening and action in the world. Sometimes people hear teachings about resting as awareness and assume this means becoming passive or withdrawing from engaged living. If I'm already complete as I am, why should I bother trying to change anything? Why work toward goals? Why engage with social issues? Why even get out of bed? This confusion arises from misunderstanding what awakening actually is. Awakening isn't the end of engagement with life, it's the beginning of authentic engagement. When you're no longer driven by unconscious needs for approval, control, or significance, your actions can serve what's actually needed rather than what your ego wants. Instead of actions motivated by inadequacy, you have actions inspired by love. Instead of doing driven by fear, you have expression flowing from fullness. Instead of performance designed to get something, you have service offering what you are. The frequency you've been blocking doesn't make you inactive. It makes you responsive to what life is actually calling for. Let me illustrate this with a story about a client who was a social activist. She'd been fighting for environmental causes for 20 years, but she was completely burned out, angry all the time, and convinced that not enough people cared about the planet. Her activism was fueled by righteous anger and despair about the state of the world. She was trying to save the earth from the assumption that it was doomed, and she was inadequate to make a difference. When she began to explore the consciousness teachings, she initially resisted. If I accept what is, won't I become complacent about injustice? If I find peace, won't I stop caring about suffering? I invited her to consider that her anger and despair, while understandable, might not be the most effective fuel for the changes she wanted to create. What if your activism could come from love for the earth rather than fear for its destruction? What if your environmental work could be an expression of joy rather than a burden of responsibility? She was skeptical but willing to experiment. Instead of reading the news first thing in the morning and getting outraged, she began her day by spending time in nature, connecting with what she was actually fighting for rather than what she was fighting against. Instead of approaching potential supporters with urgency and desperation, she began sharing her love for the natural world and inviting others to connect with their own love for the planet. Instead of seeing herself as someone who needed to save the world, she recognized herself as the Earth's love expressing itself through her particular form. The transformation was remarkable. Not only did her work become sustainable and joyful, but it became more effective. People were drawn to her presence rather than repelled by her intensity. Her projects attracted resources and collaboration in ways that had never happened when she was operating from desperation. She discovered that aligned action flowing from your authentic nature rather than your reactive patterns, has a quality of effortlessness and effectiveness that forced action can never achieve. When you're broadcasting your natural frequency, you attract the people, resources, and opportunities that align with your authentic purpose. But this doesn't mean everything becomes easy or that you never encounter obstacles. It means that obstacles become information rather than opposition. Challenges become opportunities for deeper embodiment rather than evidence of failure. Resistance becomes feedback about what needs adjustment rather than proof that you're on the wrong path. Your relationship to difficulty transforms completely when you're rooted in your essential nature rather than identified with your circumstances. But let me be specific about what this looks like practically. When you're operating from your natural frequency, decision-making becomes much simpler. Instead of endless mental analysis about what you should do, you can sense what wants to emerge through you. This isn't impulsive action based on whatever you feel like doing. It's responsive action based on what serves the whole while honoring your authentic nature. You develop what I call aligned intelligence, the ability to sense what actions will create the outcomes that serve everyone involved. Sometimes this aligned action looks like saying no to opportunities that seem appealing but don't serve your deeper purpose. Sometimes it looks like saying yes to challenges that seem difficult but call forth your genuine gifts. Sometimes it looks like resting when the culture tells you to be productive. Sometimes it looks like acting when conventional wisdom suggests waiting. The guidance doesn't come from external rules or other people's expectations. It comes from the wisdom of your own deepest knowing. But developing trust in this internal guidance requires practice, especially if you've been conditioned to seek external validation for your choices. Start with small decisions. When choosing what to eat, pause for a moment and sense what your body actually wants rather than what you think you should have. When deciding how to spend your free time, notice what genuinely calls to you rather than what seems most productive or socially acceptable. When in conversation, experiment with responding from authenticity rather than from what you think the other person wants to hear. These small acts of alignment create a foundation for trusting your inner guidance in more significant life decisions. But you'll notice resistance as you begin to live more authentically. The approval filter will activate when you make choices that others might not understand. The control filter will engage when outcomes become less predictable. The inadequacy filter will question whether you're qualified to trust your own inner knowing. This resistance isn't opposition to be fought, it's information to be integrated. Each filter is pointing to a valid concern that needs to be addressed consciously rather than reactively. The approval filter is concerned about maintaining important relationships. Honor this concern by communicating authentically about your choices rather than making changes in reactive rebellion. The control filter is concerned about security and stability. Honor this concern by making changes thoughtfully and creating appropriate structures to support your authentic expression. The inadequacy filter is concerned about competence and responsibility. Honor this concern by continuing to develop skills and seeking guidance while trusting your essential wisdom. You're not overriding these protective patterns. You're including their wisdom while not being controlled by their fears. This creates what I call integrated authenticity, expressing your true nature while remaining responsive to legitimate practical concerns. You can be authentic without being reckless. You can trust your inner guidance while remaining open to feedback and course correction. In fact, the more rooted you are in your essential nature, the more responsive you can be to changing circumstances, because you're not rigidly attached to particular outcomes or strategies. Your identity isn't invested in being right about your choices, so you can adjust quickly when new information emerges. Your worth isn't dependent on your success, so you can take appropriate risks and learn from failures without devastating self-judgment. Your security isn't based on controlling circumstances, so you can flow with life's unpredictability while remaining centered in what's unchanging. This is the practical freedom that comes from recognizing your true nature. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom to respond authentically to whatever life presents. But here's what I want to emphasize. This freedom isn't a destination you arrive at permanently. It's a moment-by-moment choice to align with what's most true rather than what's most familiar. Some moments you'll catch yourself filtering your expression and be able to shift into authenticity immediately. Other moments you'll be completely unconscious until later when you realize you are operating from old patterns. Some days you'll feel deeply connected to your essential nature and able to respond from wisdom and compassion. Other days you'll feel reactive, defended, and identified with your psychological patterns. This isn't spiritual failure. This is the natural rhythm of being human while awakening. The goal isn't to maintain constant enlightenment. The goal is to develop the capacity to recognize when you've fallen into unconsciousness and return to presence without judgment. Every time you choose awareness over reactivity, authenticity over performance, presence over the stories your mind tells, that's a moment of awakening. These moments accumulate into a fundamental shift in how you relate to your entire experience of being human. But the mind will want to measure this progress, to know how enlightened you're becoming, to have evidence that the work is paying off. This measuring mind is itself another filter, the spiritual achievement filter that turns awakening into another project for the ego. Watch for the subtle pride that can arise when you have a moment of clear seeing. Notice the disappointment that can occur when you react unconsciously after a period of clarity. These reactions are the ego trying to claim ownership of your essential nature. True recognition of your authentic self includes recognition that this awakeness isn't personal. It's not your enlightenment. It's consciousness knowing itself through your particular form. There's nothing to be proud of because there's no separate self to take credit. There's nothing to be disappointed about because there's no separate self that can fail at being what it already is. This understanding creates profound humility and genuine compassion. When you realize that everyone is the same consciousness appearing in different forms, competition becomes impossible. You can't compete with yourself. Other people's successes become celebrations rather than comparisons. Other people's struggles become opportunities for service rather than proof of your superiority. You begin to see that every being is doing their best to remember who they truly are, using whatever methods and circumstances are available to them. Some people are remembering through spiritual practice, others through art, relationships, service, or even through tremendous challenges that crack their identity open to reveal what was always underneath. Your path is not the path. Your recognition is not the recognition. Your frequency is unique, but the source from which it broadcasts is universal. This creates tremendous freedom to be authentically yourself without needing to convince others to be like you. You can share what you've discovered without attachment to whether others receive it. You can offer your unique gifts without needing validation or appreciation. Your expression becomes a celebration of consciousness rather than a strategy to get something. And this is where we begin to touch the deepest layer of what's been blocking your natural frequency. Beneath all the psychological patterns, beneath all the survival strategies, beneath all the seeking and achieving and performing, there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about why you exist. Most people operate from the unconscious assumption that they exist to get something from life: love, security, pleasure, meaning. even enlightenment. But what if your existence itself is already the gift? What if you're here not to get something, but to give something? What if your very being is what the universe is offering through you? This shift from trying to extract value from existence to recognizing yourself as the value existence is expressing. This is perhaps the most radical reorientation possible. It transforms every relationship, every challenge, every moment from a problem to solve into an opportunity to express what you are. Instead of asking, "What can I get from this situation?" you begin asking, "What wants to be offered through me in this moment?" Instead of, "How can I be loved?" the question becomes, "How can love express itself as me?" Instead of, "How can I find meaning?" it becomes, "How can meaning manifest through my unique form?" This is not about becoming selfless or denying your needs and desires. It's about recognizing that your deepest fulfillment comes not from acquiring things for a separate self, but from allowing your essential nature to flow freely into expression. When you're giving what you are, rather than trying to get what you think you need, life becomes an art rather than a struggle. And the frequency that's been blocked all this time, it's been the frequency of this generous spirit, this natural impulse to offer your authentic gifts to the world. But tomorrow's segment will reveal the deepest layer, the one assumption about reality that keeps this generous frequency locked away, even from those who can see everything we've explored today. But there's something even deeper than generous expression that remains hidden, something so fundamental to your experience that it operates like the ground beneath all perception, invisible precisely because it's so constant. This is what I call the separation assumption, the unconscious belief that you exist as an isolated consciousness, looking out at a world that exists independently of your awareness. Right now, as you listen to these words, notice how it feels to be you. There seems to be a clear boundary between the inside of your experience, your thoughts, feelings, sensations, and the outside world of objects, other people, and circumstances. This felt sense of being a separate self in a world of separate things is so convincing, so immediately obvious, that questioning it seems absurd. Of course, you're separate from what you're perceiving. Of course, there's a world out there that exists independently of your consciousness. But what if this most basic assumption about reality is precisely what's been blocking the deepest frequency of your being? Not your frequency as an individual consciousness, but your frequency as the unified field in which all experience arises. Let me guide you into a recognition that might completely shift how you understand your relationship to existence itself. Close your eyes and notice what you call your experience right now. There might be sounds, physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, maybe visual imagery even with eyes closed. Now, instead of focusing on the content of experience, notice the space in which all of this is occurring. Not a physical space, but the aware space that contains sounds, sensations, thoughts, and feelings. Can you find the boundary of this aware space? Where does your awareness end and something else begin? When you look for the edge of consciousness, what do you find? Most people discover something startling. They can't locate a boundary to awareness. The sounds aren't outside of consciousness. They're appearing within awareness. The body sensations aren't separate from consciousness. They're movements of awareness itself. Even the sense of being located inside your body dissolves under direct investigation. When you look for the observer, you find only the observing. When you search for the experiencer, you discover only experiencing. the separate self you've taken yourself to be is revealed to be a collection of experiences appearing in consciousness, not an entity that has consciousness. But this isn't just a philosophical insight. This recognition has profound practical implications for why your natural frequency has been blocked. When you believe you're a separate entity in a world of separate things, you naturally approach life from scarcity. There's only so much love, success, security to go around. You have to compete, achieve, perform, and accumulate to get your share. This scarcity assumption generates a chronic underlying tension, a sense that you need to constantly monitor, manage, and manipulate your circumstances to ensure your survival and happiness. This tension is the static that interferes with your natural frequency. But when you recognize yourself as the unified field of awareness in which all experience arises, scarcity becomes impossible. How can consciousness be scarce of itself? How can you lack what you are? From this recognition, the generous spirit we explored isn't just a nice quality to develop. It's the natural expression of abundance recognizing itself. When you know yourself as the source from which all experience flows, giving becomes as natural as breathing. You're not depleting yourself by offering your gifts, you're expressing your infinite nature. But let me be precise about what this recognition actually entails, because it's easy to turn this into another spiritual concept, rather than a lived reality. The shift from separation to unity isn't a belief you adopt or a philosophy you accept. It's a direct seeing through the illusion of being a separate observer of experience. And this seeing can happen right now as you listen to these words. Notice that there's no distance between awareness and the sound of these words. The sounds aren't traveling from outside to be received by an inside. The sounds are appearing as modifications of the same awareness that you are. Notice that there's no boundary between consciousness and whatever emotions might be arising. The feelings aren't happening to awareness. They're movements of awareness itself. Notice that even your thoughts about this aren't separate from the awareness in which they appear. The thinking mind isn't using consciousness. Thinking is consciousness in motion. When this recognition stabilizes, even briefly, something extraordinary occurs. The chronic tension of being a separate self trying to navigate an independent world dissolves. In its place, there's a profound relaxation. Not the relaxation of a person who's finally safe, but the relaxation of recognizing there was never anyone who needed to be safe. This isn't nihilism or spiritual bypassing. It's not denying the practical reality of navigating daily life. It's recognizing the true context in which all practical activity occurs. You still need to eat, work, maintain relationships, and handle responsibilities. But all of this happens within the recognition that there's no separate self doing these things. There's only consciousness appearing as eating, working, relating, and responding. This shift creates what mystics call effortless action, not because nothing requires effort, but because the one who would struggle with effort is revealed to be non-existent. There's still thinking, but no thinker. Still feeling, but no feeler. Still doing, but no doer. Actions arise spontaneously from the intelligence of the whole, rather than from the calculations of a separate part. But let me address the resistance that often arises when this recognition first emerges. The ego mind immediately protests. But if there's no separate self, who's responsible for my actions? Who makes decisions? Who has preferences and boundaries? These are crucial questions, and they point to a common misunderstanding about what the recognition of unity actually means. Recognizing that you are consciousness rather than a separate entity within consciousness doesn't eliminate functionality. It clarifies where functionality actually comes from. The personality, the decision-making capacity, the preferences, the boundaries, all of this continues to operate. But instead of being properties of a separate self, they're recognized as expressions of consciousness itself. Your unique way of thinking, feeling, and responding doesn't disappear. It's revealed to be how consciousness appears when it's filtered through your particular nervous system, history, and genetic configuration. You're not losing your individuality. You're discovering what individuality actually is. Not a separate entity, but a unique pattern of universal consciousness. Like waves in the ocean, each wave has its own distinct characteristics while never being separate from the water itself. Your personality is the wave pattern of consciousness that you represent. Your gifts, your challenges, your way of loving and creating and serving, these are how infinite awareness expresses itself as you. But here's where it gets interesting. When you stop defending your individuality as if it were a separate entity under threat, your unique qualities actually become more pronounced, not less. The wave doesn't need to defend itself against the ocean. When it relaxes into its oceanic nature, it can express its waveness more freely and creatively. When you relax the effort of maintaining a separate self, your authentic nature emerges with greater clarity and power. The frequency that's been blocked isn't your personal frequency. It's the unified frequency of existence expressing itself through your particular form. But recognizing this unity consciousness in peak moments is different from embodying it in daily life. This is where the work becomes both practical and profound. How do you remember your true nature while paying bills, dealing with difficult people, navigating health challenges, or facing uncertain outcomes? This is where we need to explore what I call unity in diversity. Living from the recognition of oneness while fully engaging with the apparent multiplicity of daily existence. The key is understanding that unity consciousness doesn't deny differences. It reveals their true nature. From separation consciousness, differences are threats to be defended against or obstacles to overcome. Your needs conflict with others' needs. Your success requires others' failure. Your happiness depends on circumstances being different than they are. From unity consciousness, differences are expressions of creativity to be celebrated. Your needs and others' needs arise from the same source intelligence. Your success contributes to everyone's success. Your happiness is independent of circumstances while still engaging with them appropriately. This isn't spiritual platitudes. This is practical wisdom that transforms how you navigate every area of life. In relationships, instead of trying to get love from another person, you recognize that love is what you both are. The relationship becomes an opportunity for love to recognize and celebrate itself in different forms. This doesn't mean boundaries disappear or that all relationships become easy. It means that even challenging dynamics are held within the understanding that consciousness is exploring relationship with itself. When conflict arises, instead of defending your position against theirs, you can investigate what aspect of wholeness is trying to emerge through the apparent discord. Sometimes this reveals that healthy boundaries need to be established. Sometimes it shows that communication needs to become more honest. Sometimes it indicates that the relationship has served its purpose and needs to evolve or end. But all of this happens from love rather than fear, from wisdom rather than reactivity. In work and career, instead of approaching your professional life as a way to extract security and significance from the world, You can offer your unique gifts as consciousness, expressing its creativity through your particular form. This doesn't mean you work for free or ignore practical considerations. It means your relationship to work transforms from transaction to expression. When your career becomes an outlet for authentic service rather than just a means of survival, work becomes energizing rather than draining. You attract opportunities that align with your deepest purpose rather than just accepting whatever pays the bills. But this shift requires tremendous trust, especially if you've been conditioned to believe that survival depends on competing in a scarce world. The transition from scarcity-based to abundance-based living often involves a period of uncertainty where old strategies no longer work, but new ways of operating haven't yet stabilized. This is why embodying unity consciousness is often described as a death and rebirth process. The identity that believed in separation has to dissolve for the recognition of oneness to become lived reality. But this death isn't literal. It's the dissolution of an illusion that was never true to begin with. What dies is the story of being a limited, isolated entity struggling against an indifferent universe. What's born is the recognition of being the universe itself, appearing as an individual expression of infinite creativity. However, this birth process isn't always smooth or comfortable. When you begin to operate from unity consciousness in a world that's largely organized around separation consciousness, you can experience what feels like culture shock. Other people may not understand your motivations or priorities. Family members might be confused by changes in your behavior. Colleagues could be suspicious of your new approach to work and relationships. This isn't because you've become strange or disconnected. It's because you're operating from a fundamentally different understanding of what's real and what's valuable. The culture around you is still predominantly organized around the assumption that individuals must compete for limited resources. Your behavior reflects the recognition that consciousness is abundantly sharing itself with itself through everyone. These two worldviews can create friction until you learn to navigate both realities skillfully. You can embody unity consciousness while still communicating in ways that separation consciousness can understand. You can operate from abundance while acknowledging others' experience of scarcity with compassion. This isn't being fake or manipulative. It's recognizing that consciousness is appearing at different levels of recognition in different people, and meeting each person where they are while remaining rooted in what you know to be true. But there's a particular challenge that arises during this integration period that's crucial to understand. When you first recognize your true nature as consciousness itself, there can be a period of what I call spiritual inflation. The ego co-opts the recognition and turns it into a new form of superiority. I'm enlightened and others aren't. I understand reality and others are still deluded. I'm consciousness and others are still identified with their egos. This spiritual pride is perhaps more dangerous than ordinary ego because it uses the language of awakening to maintain separation. True recognition of unity consciousness includes the understanding that this same consciousness is what everyone else actually is, regardless of their current level of recognition. The homeless person struggling with addiction is consciousness. The politician you disagree with is consciousness. The difficult family member who triggers all your buttons is consciousness. They may not recognize their true nature, but that doesn't make them less than what you are. It makes them the same as what you are, experiencing temporary forgetfulness. From this perspective, everyone becomes your teacher. The people who challenge you most are providing the greatest opportunities to embody unconditional love. The situations that trigger your reactive patterns are showing you where you're still holding onto subtle forms of separation. Instead of avoiding difficult people or circumstances, you begin to see them as perfect messengers, revealing exactly what aspects of unity consciousness need deeper integration. But this doesn't mean becoming a doormat or accepting harmful behavior in the name of spiritual understanding. Unity consciousness includes appropriate boundaries, clear communication, and sometimes firm action to protect what needs protecting. The difference is that these responses come from love rather than fear, from wisdom rather than reactivity. You can say no to someone's behavior while recognizing their essential nature. You can take strong action to address injustice while seeing the perpetrators as consciousness in forgetfulness rather than evil enemies. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of living from unity consciousness, maintaining the recognition of oneness while engaging fully with the practical demands of a world that appears to be filled with separation. It requires developing what I call bifocal vision, simultaneously seeing the absolute truth of unity and the relative truth of apparent diversity. In the absolute dimension, there are no problems because there's only consciousness appearing as everything. In the relative dimension, there are many problems that require intelligent, compassionate response. Both perspectives are true simultaneously, and wisdom lies in knowing which perspective is most appropriate in each moment. When someone is sharing their suffering with you, the appropriate response usually comes from the relative dimension, offering empathy, practical support, or professional resources. It would be cruel and unhelpful to respond from the absolute dimension by saying, "You are consciousness, so suffering is just an illusion." But when you're personally triggered by a challenging situation, the absolute dimension becomes more relevant. Recognizing that the trigger is consciousness appearing as a temporary experience can provide the space needed to respond wisely rather than react unconsciously. Learning to navigate between these dimensions skillfully is an art that develops through practice and often through making mistakes. You might find yourself spiritual bypassing, using absolute truth to avoid dealing with relative responsibilities. Or you might swing the other direction and get lost in relative drama, forgetting the absolute context that provides peace and perspective. Both of these are natural parts of the integration process. The goal isn't to avoid mistakes, but to learn from them quickly and return to balance. Over time, you develop what could be called embodied wisdom, the ability to access whatever level of understanding is most helpful in each situation. But let me share something crucial about this integration process that's often misunderstood. The recognition of unity consciousness isn't a permanent state that you either have or don't have. It's a recognition that can be accessed in any moment, but needs to be remembered repeatedly until it becomes your default perspective. Some days you'll wake up feeling deeply connected to your true nature, and unity consciousness will inform every interaction and decision. Other days you'll wake up feeling separate, anxious, and caught in the old patterns of trying to manage your individual existence in an uncertain world. This fluctuation is completely normal and doesn't indicate spiritual failure. Consciousness is exploring what it's like to remember and forget itself through your particular nervous system. The practice is to notice when you've forgotten and gently return to remembering, without judgment about how many times this cycle repeats. Each return to recognition deepens the groove of awakeness in your system. Each moment of remembering makes the next moment of remembering more likely. But this process can't be forced or rushed. Consciousness awakens to itself through you at exactly the pace that serves your unique unfolding. Some people have sudden, dramatic awakenings that permanently shift their perception. Others have gradual, subtle awakenings that unfold over decades. Most people experience some combination, moments of profound recognition, interspersed with periods of integration and forgetting. None of these patterns is superior to the others. They're all perfect expressions of how infinite consciousness chooses to rediscover itself. Your path is not anyone else's path. Your timing is not anyone else's timing. Your way of awakening is not anyone else's way of awakening. The only requirement is sincerity, a genuine desire to know the truth of what you are, regardless of how long it takes or how many times you forget and remember. But there's one more aspect of unity consciousness that we need to explore before we can address the deepest layer of what blocks your natural frequency. When you recognize yourself as consciousness appearing as everything, a natural question arises. If I am everything, and everything is me, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why doesn't consciousness create only blissful experiences? This question touches the mystery of why consciousness appears to forget itself and experience limitation, pain, and separation in the first place. From the perspective of absolute truth, there is no suffering because there's only consciousness playing different roles in its own dream. But from the perspective of lived experience, suffering is undeniably real and calling for response. This paradox can't be resolved intellectually. It can only be held within the heart of compassion that emerges naturally from unity recognition. When you see that your own suffering has been caused by forgetting your true nature, you naturally feel compassion for all beings who are experiencing this same forgetfulness. Their pain isn't separate from your pain. Their confusion isn't different from your confusion. Their searching isn't other than your searching. This compassion isn't pity or condescension. It's the recognition of shared identity expressing itself as the desire to relieve suffering wherever it appears. Some people express this through direct service, working with the homeless, caring for the sick, teaching meditation, or providing therapy. Others express it through creative work, art, music, writing, or innovation that uplifts human consciousness. Still others express it through their presence, being so rooted in peace and joy that they remind everyone they meet of their own true nature. There are as many ways to serve as there are individuals, but they all arise from the same recognition. The well-being of the whole is your own well-being. This isn't sacrifice or selflessness in the traditional sense. It's the natural expression of understanding what yourself actually is. When you know yourself as the whole appearing as the part, caring for the whole is caring for yourself. But embodying this understanding in a world where most people still believe in separation requires tremendous wisdom and often tremendous courage. You're being called to live from a truth that may not be recognized or supported by your culture, family, or social environment. You're being invited to operate from abundance in a world organized around scarcity, to express love in situations that seem to call for defensiveness, to respond with wisdom when everyone around you is reacting from fear. This isn't easy, and it's not meant to be easy. Consciousness is using your life to explore what it's like to embody awakeness in challenging circumstances. Your struggles aren't evidence that you're doing something wrong. They're opportunities for consciousness to discover new depths of resilience, compassion, and creativity through you. Every moment when you choose love over fear, every time you respond with wisdom instead of reactivity, every instance when you remain rooted in truth despite external pressure, these are moments when consciousness celebrates its own awakening through your individual form. But here's what I need you to understand. Even this recognition of unity consciousness profound as it is, can become another subtle form of seeking if you're not careful. The ego can co-opt even the highest teachings and turn them into projects for self-improvement. Now I understand that I'm consciousness, so I need to embody this more fully. I've recognized unity, so I should be able to maintain this awareness constantly. I know my true nature, so I shouldn't have emotional reactions anymore. These are all subtle forms of the improvement assumption we explored earlier, now applied to the ultimate recognition itself. But what if even the desire to embody unity consciousness more fully is a movement away from what you already are? What if the very effort to maintain awareness creates the illusion of someone who could lose awareness? What if trying to live from your true nature implies that you could ever be separate from your true nature? This is the most subtle trap of all spiritual seeking, turning awakening itself into another goal to achieve rather than recognizing it as what you already are. And this brings us to the final layer of what's been blocking your deepest frequency. It's not your psychological patterns, though they've provided interference. It's not your survival strategies, though they've created filters. It's not even the assumption of separation, though that's been the fundamental misunderstanding. The deepest block to your natural frequency is the assumption that there's something to block it. The very idea that your true nature could ever be hidden, that consciousness could ever be absent, that awakeness could ever be lost. This is the ultimate illusion that maintains all other illusions. What if I told you that you've never not been awake? What if every moment of forgetting has been consciousness appearing as temporary forgetfulness? What if even your most unconscious patterns have been awareness wearing the costume of unconsciousness? This recognition that you have never actually been separate from your true nature, not even for a moment, this is what finally allows the frequency to flow without any interference at all. But the implications of this recognition are so radical, so completely contrary to how you've understood your spiritual journey, that the mind will resist it with everything it has. Because if you've never been separate from awakeness, then you've never needed to seek it. If you've never lost your true nature, then you've never needed to find it. If you've never been blocked from your essence, then you've never needed to unblock it. The entire project of spiritual seeking is revealed to be consciousness playing hide and seek with itself. And the seeking is just as much a part of the game as the finding. This doesn't invalidate your journey or make your efforts meaningless. It reveals them to be perfect expressions of how consciousness explores its own nature. Every practice, every insight, every moment of suffering and every moment of joy, all of it has been consciousness knowing itself through your unique perspective. But recognizing this doesn't end the journey, doesn't. It transforms it from seeking what's absent to celebrating what's always been present. And in that celebration, something is finally free to emerge that's been waiting beneath all the seeking, all the practicing, all the trying to become what you already are. And in that celebration, something is finally free to emerge that's been waiting beneath all the seeking, all the practicing, all the trying to become what you already are. It's what I call your original frequency, not the frequency you develop through spiritual practice, but the frequency that was already broadcasting before you learned to think, before you developed strategies for survival, before you even knew you were a separate being. This is the frequency of pure existence, untainted by any story about what existence should be or could become. Right now, beneath every thought about this teaching, beneath every feeling of understanding or confusion, beneath every sensation in your body, there's a wordless aliveness that requires nothing, seeks nothing, and lacks nothing. Can you sense it? It's not peaceful or agitated. It's not joyful or sad. It's not expanded or contracted. It's the aware presence that remains constant through all states, all experiences, all changes. This presence doesn't have qualities. It's the space in which all qualities appear. It doesn't have a frequency in the conventional sense. It's the silence from which all frequencies emerge and into which they dissolve. And here's what's extraordinary. This presence has never been absent, not even during your most unconscious moments, your deepest suffering, your most complete forgetfulness of who you are. When you were completely identified with being anxious, this awareness was aware of anxiety. When you were lost in stories of inadequacy, this presence was present with inadequacy. When you were seeking enlightenment, this consciousness was already fully awake. The frequency you've been trying to access has been accessing you this entire time. You are not the seeker of presence. You are presence appearing as seeking. You are not the one who becomes conscious. You are consciousness appearing as the experience of becoming. You are not someone who has awareness. You are awareness appearing as someone. This recognition doesn't eliminate your human experience. It reveals what's been having the human experience all along. Your personality continues to function. Your preferences remain. Your unique way of expressing consciousness in the world doesn't disappear. But the center of gravity shifts completely. Instead of being a person who occasionally touches into awareness, you recognize yourself as awareness that's appearing as a person. Instead of being someone who sometimes feels connected to presence, you realize you are presence that can never be disconnected from itself. Instead of being an individual who's trying to align with their true nature, you understand yourself as true nature, expressing itself through an individual form. This shift is so fundamental that it reorganizes every aspect of your experience, yet so subtle that your daily life might look exactly the same from the outside. You still go to work, maintain relationships, pay bills, and handle responsibilities. But the one who does these things is revealed to be the same awareness that moves the stars, grows the trees, and beats your heart. Every action becomes a sacred expression of consciousness exploring its own creativity. Every interaction becomes consciousness meeting itself in different forms. Every challenge becomes an opportunity for awareness to discover new depths of resilience and wisdom through your particular nervous system. But let me address something crucial that happens when this recognition begins to stabilize. The mind might say, if I'm already consciousness, if I'm already awake, if I'm already whole, then why do I still experience problems? Why do difficult emotions still arise? Why doesn't life feel blissful all the time? These questions arise because consciousness is extraordinarily creative in how it experiences itself. Think about it this way. If you were infinite, eternal, and completely without limitation, what would you do for entertainment? You might create the experience of being limited to see what that feels like. You might forget your infinite nature temporarily to experience the joy of remembering. You might appear as individuals with problems so you could explore what it's like to solve them. From this perspective, your entire human experience, including all the difficulties, all the seeking, all the moments of forgetting and remembering, is consciousness playing in the field of its own infinite creativity. Your problems aren't obstacles to awakening. They're how awakening explores problem solving. Your emotions aren't barriers to peace. They're how peace discovers emotional texture. Your relationships aren't distractions from truth. They're how truth experiences love, conflict, intimacy, and growth. This doesn't mean you should become passive about difficulties or stop working to improve conditions in your life and in the world. It means that your efforts to create positive change can come from playfulness rather than desperation, from love rather than fear, from wholeness rather than lack. When you know that the one having problems is consciousness itself, problems become fascinating rather than overwhelming. When you realize that the one feeling emotions is awareness itself, emotions become information rather than identity. When you recognize that the one in relationships is presence itself, relationships become opportunities for consciousness to know itself through connection. Everything shifts from burden to gift, from problem to possibility, from limitation to creative expression. But this shift doesn't happen overnight, and it's not maintained constantly. The recognition of your true nature as consciousness comes and goes until it becomes so familiar that it stabilizes as your default understanding. Some moments you'll feel deeply rooted in this recognition, and everything will seem like play. Other moments you'll be completely identified with being a limited individual dealing with serious problems. Both of these experiences are perfect expressions of consciousness, exploring its own nature through you. The practice isn't to maintain the recognition constantly. The practice is to welcome whatever experience is arising without believing it defines who you are. When you feel identified with problems, you can be curious about what consciousness is exploring through the experience of problem identification. When you feel anxious, you can wonder what awareness is discovering through the texture of anxiety. When you feel confused about your purpose, you can investigate what presence is learning through the experience of purposelessness. This curious, welcoming attitude toward all experience is itself the frequency we've been exploring. It's not a particular state of consciousness. It's the open, accepting awareness that's present with all states. It's not a feeling of being awakened. It's the awakeness that's aware of all feelings. It's not the experience of being unified. It's the unity in which all experiences of separation and connection arise. And here's what's remarkable. The more you welcome whatever experience is present without trying to change it, the more naturally it transforms. Not because you're doing something to change it, but because welcoming is the natural environment in which everything can move and shift according to its own intelligence. Resistance creates fixation. Acceptance creates flow. When you stop resisting your human patterns and start including them in awareness, they begin to serve consciousness rather than limiting it. Your anxiety might transform into sensitivity that helps you notice what needs attention in your environment. Your anger might evolve into passionate engagement with injustice. Your sadness might develop into compassion for all beings who experience loss. Your confusion might mature into humility and openness to not knowing. None of this requires effort or strategy. It happens naturally when patterns are held in the space of accepting awareness rather than judgmental resistance. But there's a quality to this accepting awareness that needs to be understood clearly. It's not the acceptance of resignation. I guess I'm stuck with these patterns forever. It's not the acceptance of indifference. Nothing matters, so why try to change anything? It's the acceptance of recognition. These patterns are perfect expressions of consciousness exploring its own nature, and they're free to evolve in whatever direction serves the whole. This recognition-based acceptance creates space for organic transformation rather than forced change. From this space, you might find yourself naturally drawn to practices, therapies, or lifestyle changes that support your evolution. Or you might discover that simply being present with patterns in a welcoming way allows them to serve your highest expression. The guidance comes from the situation itself, rather than from preconceived ideas about what should happen. Trust emerges naturally when you realize that the same intelligence that beats your heart and orchestrates the rotation of planets is also guiding your personal transformation. You don't need to figure out how to evolve. You need to stop interfering with the evolution that's already happening. But let me be specific about what this non-interference looks like practically. When a difficult emotion arises, instead of immediately trying to process it, change it, or understand it, you first simply acknowledge, this is what consciousness is experiencing right now. When a challenging situation develops, instead of rushing into problem-solving mode, you first pause and recognize. This is how awareness is exploring challenge through this particular form. When you notice yourself in an unconscious pattern, instead of judging yourself or strategizing how to change, you first observe. This is consciousness appearing as temporary unconsciousness. This acknowledgement creates a space of perspective that often allows the most appropriate response to emerge naturally. Sometimes the appropriate response is action, reaching out for support, making a difficult decision, or changing something in your environment. Sometimes the appropriate response is acceptance, allowing a feeling to move through you, letting a situation unfold in its own timing, or accepting something you can't change. Sometimes the appropriate response is investigation, exploring what the experience is trying to show you, what pattern is being revealed, or what growth is being invited. The response that emerges from this space of conscious acknowledgement is usually more effective than responses that come from unconscious reactivity or forced strategies, because it's coming from the wisdom of the whole rather than the calculations of the part. But here's where we need to address a common misunderstanding about living from consciousness. Some people interpret these teachings to mean they should never plan, never set goals, never take initiative, but just wait for natural responses to emerge. This misses the point completely. Consciousness is extraordinarily active, creative, and purposeful. Look around at the incredible complexity and beauty of existence. This didn't arise from passive waiting. The difference is between activity that comes from the anxiety of a separate self trying to control outcomes and activity that flows from the creative intelligence of consciousness itself. When you're rooted in your true nature as awareness, you can plan without attachment, set goals without desperation, and take initiative without forcing outcomes. Your actions become expressions of joy rather than strategies for survival. Your projects become opportunities for creativity rather than attempts to prove your worth. Your relationships become ways for love to explore itself rather than negotiations for security. This shift from survival-based to joy-based activity is one of the most practical fruits of recognizing your true nature. Work becomes play when you're no longer working to establish an identity or escape inadequacy. Service becomes natural when you're no longer serving to feel valuable or avoid guilt. Learning becomes intrinsic when you're no longer studying to become someone other than who you are. Every activity becomes an opportunity for consciousness to express and explore itself through your unique form. But this doesn't mean everything becomes easy or that you never face obstacles. It means your relationship to difficulty transforms completely. Instead of obstacles being evidence that something's wrong, they become information about what consciousness is exploring through challenge. Instead of resistance being something to overcome, it becomes intelligence pointing toward what needs attention or adjustment. Instead of failure being proof of inadequacy, it becomes feedback about what approaches serve the whole and which ones don't. From this perspective, even your mistakes become expressions of consciousness. learning through your particular nervous system. There's no such thing as wasted time or wrong choices. Only consciousness exploring different possibilities through the gift of your individual experience. This understanding creates profound compassion for yourself and others. Everyone is doing their best to be authentic, to be loving, to be wise, using whatever understanding and resources are available to them in each moment. When someone makes choices you wouldn't make, you can see it as consciousness exploring different approaches to living rather than as evidence that they're wrong or unconscious. When you make choices that later seem unwise, you can recognize them as perfect expressions of where your understanding was at that time, rather than as personal failures. This doesn't eliminate discernment or the natural learning that comes from experience. You can recognize that some approaches are more skillful than others. Some choices create more harmony than others. Some ways of being serve love more effectively than others. But this discernment comes from wisdom rather than judgment, from compassion rather than criticism. You're not trying to be right about your choices or make others wrong about theirs. You're simply offering the clearest expression of consciousness that you can access in each moment, while remaining open to learning and refinement. This attitude creates tremendous freedom to experiment, to take risks, to try new approaches without being paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. Because consciousness learns through all experiences, the ones that work and the ones that don't, the ones that feel good and the ones that feel challenging. Your life becomes a laboratory for consciousness to explore its own nature rather than a test you could pass or fail. But let me share something that happened during my own integration of this understanding that illustrates how radical this shift actually is. For years, I had been approaching spiritual practice as a way to become more conscious, more awakened, more evolved. Even after profound recognitions, there remained this subtle assumption that I was someone who could have more or less awareness. Then one day, sitting in meditation, a simple question arose. Who would become more conscious? As I investigated this question directly, I couldn't find anyone who could gain consciousness. I could only find consciousness itself, appearing as the experience of someone who seemed to need more consciousness. The seeker was revealed to be pure awareness, pretending to be someone who had lost awareness. The one trying to become awake was discovered to be awakeness itself, playing the role of someone who needed to wake up. In that moment, the entire spiritual journey was revealed to be consciousness exploring what it's like to forget and remember itself. Not my spiritual journey, consciousness's spiritual journey, happening through this particular form. The relief was extraordinary, not because I had achieved something, but because I realized there was nothing to achieve and no one to achieve it. The frequency I had been trying to access was already fully present, broadcasting continuously, never actually blocked by anything. What had seemed like blocks were revealed to be how the frequency expresses itself when it appears to be blocked. What had felt like problems were understood to be how presence explores problem-having. What had looked like unconsciousness was seen to be consciousness appearing as temporary unconsciousness. Nothing needed to be fixed, healed, or transcended. Everything needed to be recognized as perfect expressions of the same underlying intelligence. This recognition didn't make problems disappear or eliminate challenges from life, but it completely transformed the context in which problems and challenges are held. Instead of evidence that something's wrong, they became evidence that consciousness is creatively exploring its own nature. Instead of obstacles to overcome, they became opportunities for awareness to discover new depths of resilience and wisdom. Instead of proof that you're not awakened enough, They became perfect expressions of how awakeness appears when it's wearing the costume of different experiences. From this understanding, spiritual practice doesn't stop. It becomes effortless. You're no longer practicing to become conscious. You're practicing as consciousness exploring what it's like to practice. Meditation isn't about achieving states or insights. It's consciousness enjoying the experience of sitting with itself. Self-inquiry isn't about finding answers to questions. It's awareness celebrating its own investigation of its nature. Service isn't about helping others become enlightened. It's love expressing itself as whatever form of offering wants to emerge. Everything becomes play, serious play, meaningful play, sometimes challenging play, but play nonetheless. The cosmic game of hide and seek that consciousness is playing with itself through every being, every experience, every moment. And you get to be one of the ways this game is being played. Not just a character in the game, but the player itself, appearing as a character who sometimes forgets they're playing. When you recognize this deeply, something extraordinary happens to your relationship with other people. Everyone you meet becomes consciousness in costume. The person who cuts you off in traffic is awareness exploring what it's like to be in a hurry. The family member who pushes your buttons is presence investigating what it's like to trigger reactivity. The stranger who shows you unexpected kindness is love discovering what it feels like to give spontaneously. This doesn't mean everyone's behavior is appropriate or that boundaries aren't necessary. It means that behind every personality, every pattern, every way of being in the world, there's the same essential nature that you are. Some people are very identified with their costumes and have forgotten what they're wearing. Others are beginning to peek behind the mask and glimpse their true nature. Still others are consciously playing their roles while knowing they're not limited to the character they're portraying. But all of them are the same consciousness appearing as different degrees of self-recognition. This understanding creates profound compassion without spiritual bypassing. You can see someone's essential nature clearly while also responding appropriately to their current level of consciousness expression. You can love someone unconditionally while setting firm boundaries around harmful behavior. You can serve someone's highest good while accepting that they may not be ready to receive what you're offering. The discernment becomes much more precise because it's not clouded by personal reactivity or the need to be right. You're simply recognizing what consciousness is exploring through this person and responding to what serves the awakening of the whole. Sometimes that means challenging someone's unconscious patterns. Sometimes it means providing gentle support and encouragement. Sometimes it means stepping away and allowing someone to learn through the consequences of their choices. The guidance comes from the situation itself, rather than from predetermined ideas about how you should respond. But perhaps the most profound shift that occurs with this recognition is in your relationship to time and change. When you know yourself as the timeless awareness in which all experiences arise and pass away, urgency dissolves. Not the appropriate urgency that responds to genuine time-sensitive situations, but the chronic urgency of trying to get somewhere you're not, become someone you're not, or achieve something you don't have. From this timeless perspective, everything is already complete in each moment, even as it's continuously evolving and changing. You can work toward goals without desperately needing to achieve them. You can desire positive changes without being attached to specific outcomes or timelines. You can engage fully with life's challenges without being driven by the anxiety that something is fundamentally wrong with your current experience. This creates what I call relaxed engagement, full participation without desperate attachment to results. You give everything you have to whatever you're doing, not because success will finally make you complete, but because wholehearted engagement is how consciousness expresses its creativity through you. Whether the outcome matches your preferences becomes secondary to the joy of consciousness exploring its creative potential. Success and failure both become interesting information about how consciousness manifests through different approaches rather than measurements of your worth or spiritual advancement. This doesn't create complacency or lack of discernment. You still prefer some outcomes over others. You still learn from experience and adjust your approaches accordingly. But your preferences become light and workable rather than heavy and desperate. You can want something strongly while remaining open to whatever actually emerges. You can have opinions and make choices while holding them lightly enough to change course when new information arrives. This flexibility isn't indecisiveness. It's the intelligence of consciousness adapting moment by moment to serve the highest good of all. And serving the highest good becomes natural when you realize that your individual well-being and the well-being of the whole are not separate. What truly serves you serves everyone, because the you that you truly are is the same consciousness appearing as everyone. What serves the awakening of all beings serves your own deepest fulfillment, because their awakening is your awakening. This understanding naturally guides your choices toward what creates the most harmony, the most love, the most beauty in the world. Not from obligation or spiritual correctness, but from the recognition that this is what you actually want, because this is what consciousness wants to experience through you. Your individual desires align with universal well-being, because your individual nature is revealed to be universal nature, appearing in particular form. This alignment happens naturally, without effort or sacrifice, when you stop trying to get something for yourself and start discovering what wants to be expressed through you. But this discovery requires tremendous honesty about what's actually motivating your choices and actions. Are you choosing this relationship because it serves love or because it provides security? Are you pursuing this career because it expresses your authentic gifts or because it offers status and financial safety? Are you engaging in this spiritual practice because it deepens your recognition of truth or because it makes you feel special or advanced? These aren't moral judgments. They're questions that help clarify whether you're operating from the consciousness of the whole or from the anxiety of a separate part. Both motivations are valid expressions of consciousness exploring different approaches to life, but actions that flow from wholeness tend to create more harmony and satisfaction than actions driven by separation-based needs. The more you align with what wants to emerge through you, rather than what you think you should do or achieve, the more your life becomes a spontaneous expression of creativity and joy. And this spontaneous creativity often looks quite different from what the mind thought your life should look like. And this spontaneous creativity often looks quite different from what the mind thought your life should look like. The plans you made from separation consciousness, the carefully constructed goals designed to provide security, significance, and approval, these may dissolve completely as your authentic nature emerges. The career that seemed so important might lose its appeal as you discover what truly wants to express itself through you. The relationships that felt necessary might naturally transform or end as you stop needing others to complete you. The lifestyle you worked so hard to create might shift dramatically as your values align with your essential nature rather than your conditioned desires. This isn't loss, it's liberation. But the mind will interpret it as loss, at least initially. There can be a period of genuine grief as the life you thought you wanted dissolves to make space for the life that consciousness wants to live through you. This grieving is natural and necessary. You're mourning the death of a dream, even if it was a dream based on illusion. Honor this process without trying to rush through it or spiritualize it away. Consciousness is experiencing what it's like to let go of limited identities through your nervous system. The sadness, the fear, the sense of not knowing who you are anymore. These are all perfect expressions of how awareness feels when it's releasing outdated forms of self-definition. But underneath the grief, if you're very still and very honest, you'll notice something else. A quiet excitement, a sense of spaciousness, a feeling of coming home to yourself. This is your original frequency recognizing itself, like a radio finally tuning to its native station after years of static. The signal was always there, broadcasting continuously. You're just now removing the interference that made it hard to receive clearly. And what you discover is that this frequency doesn't sound like anything you expected. It's not particularly spiritual in the conventional sense. It's not always peaceful or blissful or wise. Sometimes it's playful and irreverent. Sometimes it's fierce and passionate. Sometimes it's tender and vulnerable. Sometimes it wants to dance. Sometimes it wants to be still. Sometimes it wants to serve. Sometimes it wants to rest. Sometimes it wants to speak truth. Sometimes it wants to listen in silence. Your authentic frequency is as unique as your fingerprint, as distinctive as your voice, as individual as your way of loving. But it's rooted in something universal, the same aware presence that animates every being, the same creative intelligence that orchestrates the entire cosmos. This is the paradox of authenticity. The more truly yourself you become, the more universal your expression becomes. Not because you're trying to be universal, but because your deepest individuality is universal consciousness expressing itself through your particular form. When you stop trying to be someone else's version of enlightenment and start being your own unique expression of awakeness, you discover gifts you never knew you had, capacities that were suppressed by trying to fit spiritual ideals begin to emerge naturally. Your sense of humor might become more spontaneous and healing. Your way of showing love might become more creative and genuine. Your approach to challenges might become more innovative and effective. You stop being a generic spiritual person and become a specific expression of consciousness. Irreplaceable, unrepeatable, absolutely essential to the whole. But recognizing your unique gifts is different from claiming them as personal achievements. These gifts aren't yours in the possessive sense. They're how consciousness has chosen to know and express itself through the combination of your genetics, your history, your cultural context, and your particular nervous system. You're not the owner of these gifts. You're their custodian, their vehicle, their temporary expression in form. This understanding creates profound humility alongside the recognition of your uniqueness. You can celebrate your gifts without becoming identified with them. You can develop your capacities without claiming credit for them. You can share your talents without needing recognition or reward. The gifts flow through you to serve the whole, and the joy is in the flowing itself, rather than in being acknowledged as the one through whom they flow. This is what I call egoless expression, fully individual, yet completely impersonal. Your personality operates at full capacity, but it's no longer defended as a separate entity. Your gifts shine brightly, but they're not claimed as personal possessions. Your uniqueness is celebrated, but it's understood as universal creativity, appearing in particular form. From this understanding, comparison becomes impossible. How can you compare yourself to others when you're all expressions of the same essential nature? It would be like waves comparing themselves to other waves while forgetting they're all the same ocean. Your gifts are not better or worse than others' gifts. They're simply how consciousness has chosen to explore its creative potential through your specific configuration. The artist isn't superior to the teacher. The healer isn't more valuable than the engineer. The mystic isn't more awakened than the parent. They're all equally precious expressions of the infinite, exploring its own nature through different forms. This recognition dissolves the spiritual hierarchy that places some expressions of consciousness above others. There's no higher or lower awakening, no more or less enlightened beings. There's only consciousness appearing as different degrees of self-recognition while remaining equally itself in all its expressions. The person struggling with addiction is consciousness exploring what it's like to struggle with addiction. The sage sitting in silence is consciousness exploring what it's like to rest in emptiness. Both are perfect expressions of the infinite investigating its own nature. Neither is closer to or further from their true nature, because their true nature is what they are, regardless of their current experience or level of self-recognition. This understanding creates profound compassion for all beings, including yourself in whatever state you find yourself. When you're anxious, you can recognize, this is how consciousness feels when it appears as anxiety through this nervous system. When you're joyful, you can acknowledge, this is how awareness experiences joy through this particular form. When you're confused, you can observe, this is consciousness exploring confusion through this specific configuration of mind and body. Every state becomes equally valid as an expression of the infinite, equally worthy of being witnessed with acceptance and love. This doesn't mean all states are equally pleasant or functional. Some expressions of consciousness create more harmony than others. Some serve love more effectively than others. But all are equally perfect as expressions of consciousness, exploring its own nature. This recognition allows you to work skillfully with whatever arises while never judging it as wrong or bad. You can take appropriate action to address dysfunction, while understanding that the dysfunction itself is consciousness. Exploring what it's like to be dysfunctional. You can seek healing for trauma, while recognizing that the trauma is consciousness. Investigating what it's like to be wounded and what it's like to heal. You can work to overcome limiting patterns, while seeing that the patterns themselves are consciousness, exploring limitation and the overcoming of limitation. Everything becomes workable when it's held in this context of unconditional acceptance. But this acceptance isn't passive resignation. It's the foundation for skillful, loving action. When you stop fighting against what is and start working with what is, your efforts become much more effective. Instead of trying to force changes against the resistance of reality, you find the natural direction that reality wants to move and support that movement. Instead of imposing solutions from your limited perspective, you listen for what wants to emerge from the intelligence of the whole situation. Instead of pushing against obstacles, you discover how obstacles might be transformed into opportunities for creativity and growth. This approach requires tremendous patience and trust, especially in a culture that values quick fixes and immediate results. But consciousness operates on its own timeline, which is both instantaneous and eternal. Recognition can happen in an instant, but integration occurs over lifetimes. Understanding can arise suddenly, but embodiment unfolds gradually. The seed of awakening might sprout immediately when conditions are right, but growing into a mature expression of consciousness takes whatever time it takes. There's no rushing this process, no shortcuts to authentic realization. no way to force consciousness to recognize itself more quickly than it chooses to through your particular form. But there's also no timeline you need to meet, no schedule you're behind on, no deadline for awakening that you might miss. Consciousness has all the time in the world to explore its nature through you. Because consciousness is all the time in the world, your unique expression of awakening will unfold in exactly the timing that serves your deepest purpose and the good of the whole. Trust this timing, even when it doesn't match your mind's preferences or expectations. The delays you think you're experiencing might be consciousness taking time to integrate recognition deeply. The obstacles you think are blocking you might be consciousness ensuring that your awakening serves not just your individual freedom, but the liberation of all beings. The confusion you think proves you're not getting it might be consciousness protecting you from premature claiming of insights that haven't yet been embodied. Every aspect of your journey is perfectly calibrated to serve your authentic realization and the awakening of the whole. But recognizing this requires a fundamental shift in how you measure spiritual progress. Instead of measuring how enlightened you're becoming, you begin noticing how present you're being. Instead of tracking your spiritual achievements, you observe how naturally love and wisdom are expressing through you. Instead of comparing your insights to others, you celebrate the unique way consciousness is recognizing itself through your particular experience. The question isn't, how awakened am I? But how authentically am I expressing what I am in this moment? The question isn't, what state should I be in? But, how can I meet whatever state is arising with complete acceptance and appropriate response? The question isn't, when will I be enlightened? But, how is enlightenment appearing right now, even in this apparently unenlightened experience? These questions shift you from seeking consciousness to recognizing consciousness, from trying to become awake to noticing how awakeness is already expressing itself through whatever is happening. And what you discover is that consciousness is far more creative, far more playful, far more surprising than any concept of enlightenment could capture. Sometimes consciousness expresses as profound stillness and crystal clear wisdom. Sometimes it appears as belly-shaking laughter and irreverent humor. Sometimes it manifests as fierce compassion that challenges injustice and defends the vulnerable. Sometimes it emerges as tender love that holds suffering with infinite gentleness. Your awakening won't look like anyone else's awakening, because consciousness is exploring its nature through your unique configuration, not through some universal template. Trust your own unfolding, even when it doesn't match spiritual stereotypes or the experiences others describe. Your path is unlike anyone else's path because you are an unrepeatable experiment that consciousness is conducting in self-recognition. But here's what's beautiful. The more authentically you express your unique realization, the more you serve the awakening of others. Not because you're teaching them to be like you, but because your authentic expression reminds them of their own authenticity. When people encounter someone who is genuinely themselves, not performing, not trying to impress, not hiding behind spiritual concepts, something in them remembers what it feels like to be real. Your unfiltered presence gives others permission to remove their own filters. Your authentic expression inspires others to risk their own authenticity. Your willingness to be imperfectly genuine reminds others that perfection isn't required for love and acceptance. This is how awakening spreads, not through teaching concepts or techniques, but through the contagion of authentic presence. One person recognizing their true nature and expressing it naturally creates ripples that support everyone around them in their own recognition. You don't need to become a teacher or start a spiritual practice or write books about consciousness. Simply being genuinely yourself in whatever role life has given you – parent, partner, employee, friend, citizen – this is how consciousness serves its own awakening through you. But as we come to the end of this exploration, I want to address something that might be arising for you right now. The mind might be thinking, this all sounds beautiful, but what do I actually do with this understanding? How do I practice this? What specific techniques should I use? These questions reveal the depth of how conditioned we are to turn everything into a method, a practice, a thing we do rather than a recognition of what we already are. But the frequency we've been exploring isn't accessed through doing. It's revealed through being. It's not something you practice. It's something you are. It's not a technique you apply. It's the recognition that underlies all techniques. So what do you do with this understanding? Nothing and everything. You live your life exactly as you were living it before, but from the recognition of who's actually living it. You continue with your relationships, your work, your challenges, your joys, but with the understanding that all of it is consciousness exploring its own nature through your particular form. You keep making choices, taking actions, responding to circumstances, but from the knowledge that the chooser, actor, and responder is universal awareness appearing as individual expression. The doing continues, but the doer is revealed to be an appearance in consciousness rather than a separate entity using consciousness. This shifts everything while changing nothing. Your external life might look identical, but the context in which it's lived is completely transformed. Instead of a person having spiritual experiences, you recognize yourself as consciousness having a human experience. Instead of someone seeking enlightenment, you understand yourself as enlightenment exploring what it's like to seek itself. Instead of an individual trying to align with their true nature, you realize you are true nature appearing as an individual who sometimes seems to forget what they are. This recognition is the frequency that's been broadcasting all along, not a vibration you tune into, but the awareness that's aware of all vibrations. Not an energy you align with, but the space in which all energies arise and subside. Not a state you achieve, but the stateless state that remains present through all states. The frequency you keep blocking without realizing it is the frequency of effortless being itself. And the only thing that's ever blocked it is the assumption that it could be blocked. The only thing that's ever hidden it is the belief that it was hidden. The only thing that's ever separated you from it is the idea that separation was possible. Right now, as you hear these words, can you sense the awareness that's aware of hearing? Can you recognize the presence that's present with understanding or confusion, agreement or resistance? Can you notice the space of knowing in which all thoughts, feelings, and sensations are appearing and disappearing? That awareness, that presence, that space, that's not your frequency. That is you, not you as a person who has awareness, but awareness itself appearing as the experience of being a person. This recognition doesn't need to be maintained, defended, or achieved. It's what you are, whether you recognize it or not. But recognizing it changes everything about how life is experienced, even though nothing about life itself actually changes. The same thoughts arise, but you know yourself as what's aware of thinking rather than as the thinker. The same emotions flow, but you recognize yourself as the space in which emotions move rather than as someone who has emotions. The same circumstances occur, but you understand yourself as the consciousness in which all circumstances appear, rather than as a victim or beneficiary of circumstances. From this recognition, life becomes what it's always been. Consciousness playing with itself, exploring its own infinite creativity through the magnificent diversity of individual expressions. And you get to be one of the ways this cosmic game is played. Not just a character in the game, but the player itself, appearing as a character who's just remembered they're playing. This remembering is what we call awakening, but it's not something that happens to you. It's what you are, recognizing itself. The frequency you've been seeking is the frequency that's been seeking. The awareness you've been trying to access has been the awareness doing the trying. The consciousness you've been reaching for is the consciousness that's been reaching. You are what you've been looking for. You always have been. You always will be. And in this moment, you can stop looking and start celebrating what was never actually lost. The frequency is broadcasting now, has always been broadcasting, will never stop broadcasting. Tune in whenever you remember, but know that whether you remember or forget, whether you're tuned in or distracted, whether you feel connected or separate, the broadcast never stops. You are the eternal frequency of consciousness itself, appearing as this temporary, beautiful, absolutely unique expression of infinite awareness. Rest in that. Be that. Celebrate that. You are home. You have always been home. Welcome to the recognition of what you've never not been. Take a breath. Feel the aliveness that doesn't come and go. Notice the awareness that remains present through all changes. Rest as the space in which this entire experience is arising. That's your original frequency. That's who you are. That's what you've always been. And now you know.